Good afternoon. This is Ann Pickering with MIR3 joining Jim Satterfield. Jim, how are you today?
We're doing great. A little snow here in Atlanta.
Well, a little snow and a little rain and maybe some sun later today, so we'll get a little bit of all the seasons along the way.
We're going to have to figure out if this is a crisis or a consequence.
Right now the consequence is there's no bread or milk in any of the grocery stores.
Oh, that's right. All gone. It stopped snow. Hey, wait, the snow stopped. It must all be solved.
It's done, but we're not going to have a snowmageddon as we did, 3 years ago, too. So hopefully it'll be just fine here, but it has mesmerized me. Well, thank you very much for everyone who's joined us. We're looking forward to today's webinar and the topic consequence management at its best and its worst. And I'm sure that Jim and I are going to have some very creative discussions because we have nothing scripted here, so anything we say will be creative along the way. Just a couple of housekeeping notes here to make sure that we cover those in the very beginning. I would just say that we are going to produce, as we always do here at MIR3, a briefing document that we will distribute to everyone who registered. So if there are requests for copies of the slides, you will be getting the briefing document that encapsulates the material we covered here and what we talk about today. So our marketing team is diligently gathering their notes today from what we say to add that content to today's webinar. So look forward to that briefing. If you have questions, Jim and I are both more than able and also willing to answer any questions that you might have. So if you'll use the question panel through the webinar, we will be able to have those monitored, and I think Bill will inject those in an appropriate moment when he could catch us not talking.
Well, we'll hope it'll be appropriate.
Right. And we'll answer those, and if there are any that are simply a little bit off target, Bill will also hold those to the end and try and pull those in. So we hope we're going to leave a few minutes for questions at the end, so please, whatever you prefer, participate, join by sending the questions. So with that, I would like to say one other thing about the disclaimer of what we're doing, because it's always so important. As Jim and I are speaking here today, we are speaking from the heart. It is our opinion and experience of things we personally have seen, not necessarily the reflection of MIR3 or Firestorm as a whole. And we always try to put that disclaimer. As a matter of fact, the disclaimer was not in the deck until about 5 minutes ago, and Jim looked at me and said, "Where's our disclaimer we always put in here?" So we real quickly pull that forward, and as you'll know, Jim and I, with the experience we bring to the table, have a lot to offer, and we totally disclaim knowledge of any of it.
No, and I was going to say, we normally are just disclaimed ourselves as we come along.
So Jim, why don't you give us a little background for a moment about yourself, and so the audience that might not be familiar with your experience, how that's going to play in today's discussion.
Well, we're excited to talk to everyone today. This is Jim Satterfield. I'm president and one of the founders of Firestorm. We're a crisis management firm. We just finished celebrating our 10th anniversary, which is always exciting to get into that area. And the subject of crisis and consequence certainly has been one that we focus on and do on a regular basis. And Ann and I have worked together in the past and continue to do webinars and events and live and in person. We were in New York City just a week ago, and to run together. So if you're new to Firestorm and the event today, welcome. Glad to have you. We did a workplace violence virtual exercise yesterday. We had a little over 1,050 registered for that, so that was an exciting event. And coming up in April, we're going to do cyber breach as a virtual exercise. So would encourage you to be a part.
Yes, we should make sure we participate. So Jim, thank you very much for joining me. Many of you who know my background know already that, as Jim mentioned, we work together. So I've been with MIR3 and currently now their president and chief operating officer, but have probably 7 years ago spent a couple of years working with Firestorm in some of their specialty areas in crisis management, business continuity. I come from a background of technology, but then quite a bit of years, and we'll just say in that 20-ish range of business continuity and crisis communications, which plays very well in terms of our conversation today.
And you started at 16.
I was. I was very, very young when I started doing that, and so leads me to have many, many more years to get involved in that. So I think it'll be a great conversation for us today, and one that you will find some very good suggestions or walkaways. At least I hope they are, from a standpoint of what you're doing with your program.
So why did we pick this topic?
Well, you know, that was interesting because crisis or consequence, and what are we really dealing with? And that was one of the things that I've always challenged our organizations with, or people that I've worked with from a consultative standpoint, because I think often, even in everything we say or do, every step we take, there's a consequence for what we do. There's not always a crisis, but there's a consequence. And we feel that in our analysis, these go hand in hand along the way. So would you?
I think that we get is emergency, incident, crisis, and sometimes we get so wrapped up into that, we don't get a chance to focus on the consequences of all those decisions. And that's really what we're going to stress today, and maybe bring in a little bit of structure that might be of help.
Yeah, I think it will be.
I think you've got a definition about crisis.
So crisis, what is a crisis? Well, I thought this is interesting because, you know, I think you can easily defend, coming out of the Oxford dictionaries, the first definition, kind of add a little bit put together, that crisis is really a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger when a difficult or an important decision must be made. Now, that's kind of generic, and you probably all knew that already. But more importantly, the definition that Jim proposed, and we would probably bring a little bit of discussion to that, is, could a crisis be defined as any risk event in which we really haven't identified the vulnerability or exposure? Now, I'm going to stop there for a second, and I'm going to say that could be true from a crisis, but it could also be one we have identified, or that we've tried to address from an exposure standpoint, whether we have or have not written a plan to go with it. But more importantly, we've been presented with some situation or event in which we have to respond, and not necessarily always just as we planned.
Well, one of the things that's been happening is we've been focused on crisis, and all our plans are based upon our experience in managing crises, is that we've come to the conclusion that crisis is a peril, just like a fire or a flood. And most have not yet fully recognized that. And we're seeing some changes, particularly in the insurance industry, in terms of triggers of in policies around that subject. So we're going to be talking a lot more about that in the coming months as we talk about crisis as a peril and what's going to become involved. So if we've got a crisis, looks like we might want to manage that crisis.
Correct. And you know what? In some cases, Jim, when I first started in this industry, and there were a lot of great folks teaching me a good bit about what I know today, we used to call everything a crisis. And I think we find that, well, it really probably, you know, in the early days it was when we were dealing with those. But what we've done is, as we've matured in the industry and as we've matured as professionals, not every event is really a crisis. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But more importantly, whether it's what you would call a crisis or an incident or whatever, it has to be managed. And that's what we really wanted to talk about here.
And when I look at the slide, the couple of things that jump out is that the crises can be very short in duration. It's just that the consequences are going to last for an extended period. And so what we see in many cases is decisions are made and actions are taken without regard to what the consequences of those particular decisions are going to be at that point in time.
I thought it was interesting years ago, and I won't say where, but I was actually facilitating an exercise, and it was a pretty sound simulation of a real event. And as we were trying to work through the exercise, we reached a point that we had to make a decision about a particular action. And so it was an injection that really wasn't well scripted, and we didn't intend for it to be, but what came out of that was a directive to the remote staff to take action in a particular way that we didn't realize it, so there was a consequence associated with that. But it was very interesting. They brought it up in the hot wash after the event that as a team, that really, even during the event, disturbed them because of the response that we had made coming out of the command center. So everything comes with a consequence, and that one dealt us quite a few, both in terms of the exercise and the knowledge that we really weren't in sync or in line with what our employees were thinking in that regard. So be they short, be they long, they're definitely something we have to deal with, and the consequences live far beyond the actual event that we're managing.
And obviously, as the slide that's up talks about, the crisis could be over before help could arrive from the outside professionals that are coming in. And the concept that you know what you know and you don't know what you don't know, that certainly is intensified in a crisis experience. So that it's really a function of making sure that you're as prepared. We're not going to write plans for every single peril that we could face or every single risk or threat or vulnerability. Many of our responses can be dealt with in aggregate. So this response would cover a wide range of perils. And obviously it's important as we focus on this, it goes beyond traditional business continuity. It looks into communicable illness, and we're doing a lot of work in cyber breach response right now.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting, as we go through it, the same 5 common failures that we see in any disaster or crisis are true in a cyber breach. And the largest point of failure is supply chain failure, where the breach came in via the supplier. So looking at these things, it seems to come together.
Well, I think that as we look at this, one of the things that we've always tried to do is build around all hazards planning. And in that, I still think, and I probably should save this comment for my DRJ session when I have a chance to participate on what the future of this industry is going to look like, but I really believe that sometimes we still get too in the trenches trying to come up with what our plan should be, task by task, action by action, to the point that we don't leave ourselves with enough flexibility to move based on the consequences we're dealt. So I think that goes a little bit further to our next comment along the way, which is around this whole planning thing. We plan so that we know how to respond to any crisis that hits, and yet when we really stop and think about it, we really never know how things are going to actually go during that event, how it's going to unfold. And we keep telling everybody, just as we've learned, that you might as well be prepared, because you're going to have to take action. Jim, we were talking about without knowledge, right, necessarily, and without full disclosure as to what's developing along the way. So we really have to be very flexible and deal with how our plans should be written in a way that will give us the flexibility to move.
And recognizing there are going to be a lot of moving parts within the crisis, and particularly as upper management becomes involved, it will change it, because they want to take and jump in a particular direction that maybe wasn't in the plan.
Right.
They know better than you. They've got a different insight. And so if it's a crisis, it's going to get exposure within your organization at the highest level and bring you assistance that you may or may not need at that point in time to look at the direction.
You know, I probably had one of my eye-opening experiences, it's a good many years back now, so when I had the opportunity to help design what I thought the appropriate incident management software product was. And I actually had this discussion yesterday with a client as we were talking about managing any event that happens in an organization. But my whole thought at that point, I'm almost embarrassed to talk about it now, is that I felt like all we had to do was status every line item in our plan. Action 1, you do this, what's the status? Action 2, you do this, what's the status? And percentage complete, and a little bit of interdependencies between the two. And in reality, the first major event that we wanted to manage through that, of course, what happened? Things changed. The plan had to change dynamically, and there we were in a structure that was going to be much harder to implement than we expected.
So it brings us to what's a consequence. We've certainly been talking about what's a crisis and those elements, and we're focused here on the impact, the effect, the result, the outcome of something that's already occurred. It's not we're not worried now about what can we do to prevent it or mitigate it. That's already over. The egg's already broken, and that's not a particularly appetizing picture on this slide as we look at it. And so one of the things I think that will help the business continuity professional is thinking about and communicating and talking on the subject of consequence. Because when you look at the C-suite, when you look at the board, you look at senior management, they're going to be focused on what's the consequence of these actions as they come together. Now, when you think about it, every time, good, bad, or indifferent, everything that we do is going to have some type of reaction. There'll be a consequence associated with that. And it's going to be amplified or changed or modified within the organization. So when we talk about consequence management, we've already talked about a consequence. Now we're trying to steer it. And we'll talk about communications a little bit later and why communicate and those times. Many of the times we've seen those communications shift the consequence factor significantly in each of these areas. And so just as you said about selecting a tool earlier, we're going to have to deviate. If we focus on mitigating those consequences so that they're not as severe, we're going to have to call an audible. We're going to have to change from where we're going. By the way, I used the term audible yesterday, and the person looked at me and goes, "What does that mean?"
No.
And I couldn't, obviously not raised in the South to go from there.
Right.
And so, in fact, I think there was a game this week.
Well, as a matter of fact, I had an interesting challenge. I sat in the, I don't know if I should say this because it has a consequence. Okay. So I sat in the hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina on Sunday night and watched the Super Bowl game, and I have to admit, I'm a Denver fan, so I'm a Peyton Manning fan more than anything. So with that being said, I understand the word audible, and I understand how Peyton uses that, because I don't know if you heard, and I didn't really hear it that much. I guess there was too much noise Sunday night, but when Peyton lines up on his offensive line and he's getting ready to start the play, the first thing he's doing is he's kind of got his eyes going left to right, looking obviously at what the defensive team is doing, and you'll often hear him yell, "Omaha, Omaha," maybe a third time. I put 3 in here. And my interpretation of that, and Jim, this is just growing up in the South with SEC football and being a big football fan and football family, it's like, well, I kind of thought I had a good plan when I walked up here, but now that I look at it, maybe it's just not the right thing for me to do.
Well, and I think when we talk about consequence, the conclusion to draw here is experience makes a difference. We often say that a crisis is not business as usual, it's business as unusual. And so planning for this and getting the experience of making decisions in a crisis becomes extremely important, or we're going to see this consequence management become an even bigger issue.
Well, one of the things I try to help and mentor and talk to people is that every time that you're getting ready to make a decision, and whether it's decision on how I'm going to answer a question, how many times have I boxed myself into a corner by not thinking before I spoke, but more importantly,
you're supposed to think before you speak?
It helps sometimes, but more importantly, before you do something, I'm always trying to say, if I take that action, what are the things that I'm going to have to deal with as a result of that action? Are they all going to be pleasant? Which one has the best outcome? And you have to assess, I like to say, a couple of steps beyond where you are now, so the decision you have, you're going to know what you're going to deal with. Otherwise, it's going to be, as you're dealing through any of these very critical and time-sensitive events, it's going to be very hard to make a decision because there's going to be another one that slams you right in the face the moment it happens. And I know Jim with Firestorm today deals in, as they say, crisis management. So they're working with organizations that's why they're getting involved and get the call to help, because it's just one slam right after another, and it's the 1, 2, 3 punch that gets people along the way. and they haven't thought through the consequences of some of the decisions they're making.
Well, and the word why here is always a big thing. Why are you about to do this? Why are you about to say that? That's going to make a difference. Because following every crisis, there's going to be consequences. And it's not just one consequence. It's a cascading event. So I guess we should have shot this slide with a bunch of broken eggs instead of just one. It gives the conclusion that there'd only be one thing that would be occurring at that point. Because everything is intertwined. And you can't move this portion of your plan, or you can't take these comments or these actions without affecting others. And so I think the challenge that we face as business continuity professionals is understanding that, recognizing it, and knowing what we can control, what we can't, and making sure that we're not making it worse just by our decisions along the way.
Right. And it's not an easy world to live in when we're doing these crises. And now we move into what really becomes the discussion around consequence management and how each decision we make has, a domino effect. Obviously, we went with that theme in terms of what we're doing. And I think it's so important that we understand that flexibility. And unfortunately, in some of the earlier events I dealt with in my career, I found that we became very frustrated when things didn't go just as planned. And, I have organizations today. We had a session we did recently that our other co-presenter also mentioned this very thing, that you can plan the first step you're going to take. You can plan the actions that you need from communications, etc. But most importantly, what you can't plan is what's going to happen after that first step.
And in fact, we're hearing of a consequence already. Bill was saying that there's some music playing back in the background. And we talked about singing this webinar, but I don't know where the music came from. We apologize. We're working on the technical difficulty as we go forward.
I haven't heard it. So
I haven't heard it either.
We're in good shape. So Bill came in right when I was talking. It's like there's music somewhere in the background. So if one of you happen to be playing music and you're not muted, would you do that for us, please? And it'll won't distract us anymore, but maybe a few of the attendees. So back to consequence management, Jim.
Well, when you look, the last bullet on this page, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time, because when you see these events and the crisis occurs and you're starting to respond to each individual consequences, how you respond could then create that second crisis. And we've got to look that in many cases those second crises make it so much worse than where you were to begin with. There's a rule that if you're explaining, you're losing, and you're overcompensating with that message element associated with it. So we've got to focus that in, or we'll have, and I thought your graphics team did a great job with the falling dominoes, because you're seeing the pressure that this gentleman is trying to hold up with these dominoes as they start to go down along the way. That pressure will start to build. So that next crisis is going to be created by the communications or the decision around that very first thing, and it will overshadow whatever we've seen in the individual crisis.
Correct.
At that point.
So Jim did a good job of putting together a couple of event examples, and I don't mean to, I do mean to give him all the credit, not all the blame for this one as well, but I think we just picked a couple of examples that we wanted to talk about that, something is happening, and then the real question is, what's going to happen next? Is it really over, and what are you going to have to deal with? So we thought that would be a good way to talk about two fairly reasonable things that had happened or have happened, Jim, that you've been involved with or seen people have to deal with, and then what those outcomes really end up being as a result of how they manage through those.
And as you hear them, and as we go through them, I'd like you to stop and think about what comes next. What would I say? What would I do associated with each of those? And what's the consequence that I'm concerned about? So we're going to follow a formula here. I call it Paul Harvey, after the old announcer that was a newscaster. Now you know the rest of the story. So we're going to share a little bit of that example as we go through and think about it, and ask you to work through these areas while Ann and I talk over those examples. So we're going to look right now and take a fire. There's a fire in the facility. Now, immediately, if there's a fire, we activate our emergency plan. We're going to probably get all of our people out of the buildings. We call 911 and get the first responders incoming. And we want them to be, as in any impact assessment, as we look at those 5 stages that we think of a crisis: pre-action, onset, impact assessment, response and recovery, and then the consequence management. We didn't have any fatalities. So obviously it would have a different feeling if we had done that. Now, as it continues going on, the crisis is over. The fire is out. So what we would do is start to look at what occurred. How did we communicate during that period of time? Employees fear that they were exposed to maybe some life-threatening chemicals. That's going to create a whole series of consequences that would be coming up and looking at. The media finds an employee willing to be interviewed on the TV. It would be the person going, ooh, 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 focus the camera on me. Everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame, and we, as everyone knows, do a lot of work in the school marketplace. And after any type of an event, there's always somebody who's saying, well, they didn't tell us what to do, and we always knew that that person was a problem. And
how do they always find that person?
Well, and they also look for the ones that probably had a cocktail earlier in the day coming in, and hopefully the teeth aligned. No, that's not a good story. But as you think about it, it's amazing they find that one person that has a grudge or an issue, and that comes into play associated with it. And so once those things start to come out, that, wait a minute, all these people were exposed to life-threatening chemicals, and nobody warned us and told us about that. We didn't have any protective clothing. We had no gear. We had no other understanding. Now it's not the fire. Now we're talking about all these other things. What's the message that we would want to get out then to the employee? What do we want to do with the media, if anything, at this point in time? And we've got to get these people coming back to work. Our plant wasn't badly damaged. We have to keep making these things.
So now you're dealing with a consequence to an issue that you never anticipated, because you never thought. We always plan for, as we said, the all hazards. So, okay, we have a fire. We displace people. We know how to get them out of the building. We know what's going to happen as far as our insurance process. But what we don't realize is the negative reaction from the press or our employee base, et cetera. So now we're dealing with what we used to call a crisis in a crisis. But more importantly, you're right, it is another consequence we're managing.
And I would guess that most of the business continuity plans that we look at now, as we look across companies, haven't thought about and identifying in these issues in their plan. What are you going to do about the chemicals here? What are you going to do if there's a fear, if there's been an employee exposure? Right. What are the messages that we're going to say? So those things are having to be developed on the fly, and then if they're developed incorrectly, now you've got a new consequence. Now the problem has continued to escalate. And so let's take a little closer look at this particular crisis. Is a plant blowing up a big issue? Yeah, it'd be huge. If it's my plant, it's a big issue associated with it. But there are things that we know we do. We've got risk management. We bought an insurance policy to be able to deal with that. If you think about injured workers, well, sure, there's workers' compensation, but is that enough? How do we notify their families? How do we communicate at this point in time? What are we going to do? Is there disabilities that are going to have to be put into place? Now, if we've had injured employees and an explosion in chemicals, then our friends from the government are going to come. Mm-hmm. And I'm just here from the government. I'm just here to help. OSHA is coming forward, and so there will be an investigation and fines. We're seeing this also true in workplace violence scenarios, where OSHA has identified that is a hazard in the workplace and to bring in, so it doesn't even have to be an explosion to come. We've talked just mentioned the communications to the families of the employees that were hurt, but what about all the families of the employees that weren't hurt? They're going to say, well, you need to find another job. That's not a place that you go forward and work in. One of the turnover issues, if there's been a shooting in the workplace, there's a 50 to 60% workforce turnover. That's an unintended consequence. I will guarantee you that if you went out and pulled a bunch of workplace violence prevention plans, turnover is probably not mentioned in any of them. So now we're shifting the focus away from the crisis, from the emergency, from the incident, saying there are all these consequences. They start to escalate. They start to combine. And we can rebuild the factory. How long is it going to take? Will we get employees to come in associated with it? And, oh, don't we sell something? We need customers. And so if we're not making our product or our service at this point in time, they're going to go to work for, go and buy from somebody else. And now we've lost the business, and we might not even be able to survive even if we had this insurance policy in place. That's where this transforms in becoming a business crisis risk within it.
And this is where I would contend that as a professional, our industry is changing as well. We used to be able to shut down our involvement and walk away and say, oh, business as usual, we're back. Maybe we're a little severe here when we're talking about a major plant fire or blow up, but the reality is in some situations where I see us extending our role with organizations is helping manage through these consequences all the way through completion and shutdown of every one of those. So it's expanding us from the disruption from a business perspective to the ongoing business operational component.
Well, you used a term a while ago that everybody on the call is familiar with, all hazards. Mm-hmm. We thought, we're doing all hazards. Well, if you didn't deal with everything here that's on this slide, you didn't do all hazards. And so there's a very narrow definition historically of what all hazards mean. It doesn't include all consequences. And so if you're going to do all hazards, it should be all hazards and all consequences. That's really what we're trying to bring up today to show a difference in thought.
Correct.
Shall we do another?
Yeah, let's do one more, a little bit different one that you came up with along the way.
Let's see. This one is this is still on our fire. There's a fire in the facility. What do we have, an explosion last night?
No, all right. So, all right, you know what? We have a bad slide here because it was all around. Now, see, neither you nor I caught that one along the way.
Well, so now you're dealing with consequence management as a result of that.
So if you want to, we'll talk about the one that was really, it was a sexual molestation that happens in the environment. Gets reported. You know that story well. You can ignore your slide.
Well, it did startle me when I had to look at this. And so, by the way, we had a team, and we just didn't get it all pulled together as it came in. When we were looking at this, and we have an event, and if this had been a sexual molestation or even a violence episode, now we're dealing with a human impact. And what we see are stories that will come out creating the same type of an escalation. And fortunately, our next slide will have some of the impact associated with it. But before I go to that, people are going to say, we knew he was a problem. We knew that was going to happen. And why didn't you do something? And so what are we going to do about our brand and reputation? Do you really want to send your child to a school where the head of the school has been charged in this area as sexual molestation? Are there tools that we could know what's being said in the media right now? And that's the whole concept you've heard us talk about in some of the Firestorm webinars around predictive actionable intelligence, having an intelligence network associated with this and being able to see what's occurring and what's being said and communicated. Because we don't have to wait today for it to appear in the traditional media. It's already up. Everyone is empowered with a smartphone today. They're taking pictures. They're shooting video. And you're going to see that up on the screen. The crane falling in New York City last week. There were video up of watching that crane actually come down associated with it. But in these areas where it involves human performance in the workplace, either bullying or violence or in this case sexual molestation, we're going to see that this is going to have a disproportionate impact on your business. The consequences of working there are going to be one that could lead to turnover, brand and reputation, people not wanting to do business with you and thinking in those areas. So if we go back to, just like we looked at our business continuity plan, when you look at your workplace violence plan, and you think sexual molestation or hostile workplace or be factors that would be included in, have we thought about what happens now we have uncovered this? Our whole plan has been trying to identify that person who could deal with it, get them out of the workplace and gone, but the plan doesn't say, what are you going to do now? What are you going to do about the things that are on the screen? The plans don't say that. So as business continuity professionals, you're dealing with the actions that you take in the emergency. You're evacuating, you're lockdown, you're lockout. You're getting the police involved and doing the investigation. You're getting this individual arrested. But what about all the consequences of that aren't written into your plans? And so our conversation today was the idea to take this to the next step, to the next generation of saying, if you really want to be in compliance, if you really want to be seen as strategic within your company instead of tactical, you're going to have to be able to deal with the consequence management portion of this and build that into your planning as a completely different section.
Well, I think it's a value added because typically as business continuity consultant, we're not getting involved when there's any type of, sexual molestation event in our company or whatever. But what we can do is set our platform and our methodology together that can be used to manage through any kind of event. And we don't even have to be there, but we've given them the tools and the understanding. So that's what we want to talk about today, is taking all of these concepts and asking the question you're probably saying, okay, Ann, Jim, get us to the point. What can we really do differently than what we've done, or what can we learn from experience that we would recommend? And I'm a creature of habit. I like structure in what we do. As a professional, we follow that plan, do, check, act, or PDCA methodology, and it's a step-by-step approach that we have. And I think we can apply methodology to consequence management as well. The very first thing is understanding one key thing, which I think is so important. So I'm going to give you a walk-away right here that I would highly encourage you do some reading around emotional intelligence. And think of emotional intelligence, and some people refer to it as emotional quotient, your EQ or EI, as the way that you recognize how your actions or statements are received and influence other people's emotions. And understand that they're going to react differently and be able to recognize that. Don't just presume they all hear it the same way that you're trying to say it, and use that to guide your behavior and thoughts and actions along the way. And if you do any reading on this, and this is there are a number of books that I would recommend. Daniel Goleman writes, let's see, it's Goleman, and I just recently read another of his they're short reads, great reads, and then of course you can go take the survey on what is my own EI or EQ and get a feeling for whether you have reached the ultimate or need to work in a certain key area. Because I think that understanding this and applying this concept will help you make better decisions, because we are thinking about how those decisions are going to be received and the statements we're going to make. And I think it really matters when you're dealing with a crisis. So those that I see deal with it successfully are those that remain calm, but understand and conceptually know before some action is taken how people are going to respond to that.
Exactly. And we're not cookie cutters. We're all going to respond differently. Yeah. And what we've seen in many of these situations is some people freeze, some people act, some people will leave. Now we're going to talk about a new concept.
Yep. Another methodology. So I'm going to add with plan, do, check, act. We're going to do OODA, as we would call it. And last week I walked around going, OODA, 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 just as I was laughing about it. But I think it's a great way you can think about it. And it goes back to exactly the key steps. I'm going to observe. Then I'm going to orient myself to my observations. And then I'm going to decide what to do, and I'm going to take action.
And then we're going to act.
So tell me a little history about OODA.
There was a United States Air Force colonel, John Boyd, who's credited with this approach. Colonel Boyd apparently was more effective at shooting down in the Korean War the North Koreans MIGs at this point in time. And so the leadership came to him and said, why are you so good? It's not like you, Ann. We always know that you're so good. But they came to him, why do you do so much better than everybody else who's attacking exactly the same problem? And his comment was, I do it faster. He had observed that the MIGs could not respond as quickly as his plane, and they couldn't anticipate. So he would take an unusual decision. He might suddenly veer to the right or soar to the left or dive or go up. And the pilot in the MiG was confused, and before he could operate, he then made another change, and he was then able to shoot it down. As a result of that, the Air Force then started training all pilots in to observe, orient, decide, and act. And it's a way to keep this cycle going. You'll see the word quickly here. Now, if we were talking about doing plans in a school in 2-year-olds, in second graders, we don't want them out deciding should we stay or should we go or what should we do associated with it. We want them to follow what the teacher and the school's plans are. But when we're dealing in a business environment and a workplace violence side, we've got adults there, and where we've got flee, hide, fight terminology. How do you know what to do? If you've heard the gunman in the area and he's on way down the hall and you've got an exit right where you are, evacuation is obviously the correct area. So if you start to think about the consequences and the management and the decisions and the crisis, looking at this will begin an element. And you see the word feedback is listed here. And as you get the observation, you put it over to orient, where are we, what are we thinking about doing? Then you've got to make a decision, what are our options that we're going to do? And then you're not going to wait. Again, if that bad guy with a gun was out in the hallway and we've got a chance to get out now, we need to get out now, not wait for that decision. So as we look at it, here's the explanations as we start to take this process apart. We observe whatever's going on around us. We can be observing not only situations, but events and comments and consequences that are there. And then we try to orient what's going on versus the way that we're going to act. And then we can't wait here. We have to make a decision. We use a lot of times speed as quality. To know to act now versus having to wait until the other area is fully obtained. When we're dealing with management, many times they want to have reports and data and specific information to come into play. In a crisis, you're not going to have that. And so what you're going to have to do is to make decisions based upon information that's even probably wrong, but using all these skills that you've developed to make an act. Now, you have to have that feedback loop, so if that's the wrong decision, you can correct it and come back, because this way you have a better chance for a positive outcome.
And one of the things I think is so important here to me is, I mean, obviously we're all observing the evolving situation, but the one time I think we sometimes jump quickly to decide is, I see people historically missing this whole orientation, which, let me stop and think about, in relevance to our company culture, my personal understanding and beliefs, etc., and my experience, it's all going to shape how we view and what we see. We've got to be really thinking about that. We have to understand that we do have our own rose color of glasses, whatever it would be, that are influencing what we're observing. So we've got to be very, very careful that that doesn't lead us to make the improper decision. So there was a lot written up in reading about this around the whole step of orientation, much more than the obvious, I'm going to observe, I'm going to make a decision, and of course I'm going to act on it. So it does tell us a lot about what we're doing, and I can tell you again, it's understanding corporate culture, and my example I gave earlier, the decision that was made by the crisis team and the action that was given to the field team was not in alignment with their corporate culture. And that was what bothered the team who received the message of what they were going to do. And I think it was just a great example of varying from the intent of our orientation during this process. So Jim, any other comments
No,
about that one?
I think we've kind of developed a new term, or at least let people be aware of this term that's been around for well over 50 years now. But it's not in the context of business continuity and crisis management and consequence management, and it's a way to start to think through those areas. So we're going to try to talk a little bit more about how we apply it to some various situations to see if that will be helpful as we think through that.
Right. I think we're right on time where we thought we would be, so we'll be watching in case anybody has any questions. So I think we're due to finish up probably in about 10 more minutes, so that'll give us a little bit at the end. But, you know, when we really think about applying some of that, it goes back to what I said, that one step ahead. It's just not the decision in front of you, it's the result of that and what's going to take action.
And in fact, as you look here, it's even thinking more than one step, it's multiple steps ahead. If you, not many people on the call today know that Ann is a grand champion in the area of chess. And she,
neither did I, by the way.
There you go. We should play for money now. This could be fun. But as you think about in the environment when people are doing this, they're thinking not this move, not the next move, but about 4 moves down, what's going to happen. And when we talk about why communicate or why media, that's an example of thinking. If I put this message out now, if I give the team this instruction, how will they react? What will they think? What problem will that go on? And so mapping this out, taking the time to stop and say, what are the possible outcomes of this decision? If we do this, what is that going to mean? How are people going to respond? How is it going to become more complicated? And then if they're going to, for every action, there's a reaction as we think through this process. We then need to take that one and carry it the next step and the next step. So as you've looked at your plans, as you review them in each of these areas, I'd like you to stop and think about what is the consequence if we do that? What's it going to mean to each of our stakeholders, customers, employees, the community around our location? How is that going to come together? And when we see these consequences start to emerge, what are we going to do about them? So it's a matter of, and we had sports up earlier talking about it, and you'll talk about many times an athlete in this area where the game slows down in their mind. They now can see that's happening and going forward. As we look at, in a football analogy, sometimes you'll see them put a person in motion to see how the defense reacts so that they can make that decision. As you think through this, we want you to observe and orient and take your team. The next time you do a tabletop exercise and you talk about it, focus on the consequence management portion at each escalation and saying, what are the possible consequences that could come from this? Most all of the exercises that I've observed, I have seen no discussion of that. It's like, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and nobody's going to say, well, what's it going to happen there? And so make these decisions, make this focus in a timely manner, and it's got to be a team. As you had your team pushing against you there in that example, that's certainly one that's not going to get us to where we need to be.
And there's never enough time to assess it as much as we want, so time is of the essence.
Well, I would tell you that I'd rather have a B than wait for an A+.
Yes, for
because
sure.
These events are moving very quickly. So we're going to talk about communication.
Yeah, and we have to. We are MIR3, right? That's what we do.
Right.
We communicate. We share information. We make sure the information gets out, the right information. And this is where I really want to talk about. In times of crisis, when we're communicating, there becomes some very critical things that we need to think about. And first of all, Jim, before we even talk about why is it critical, it's that whole why communicate in the first place, right? So is that communication really critical to be delivered, and to whom, etc.? So you have a great story around, or an approach to communication in crisis.
Well, there's a lot of things here to think about. If we're going to communicate, who are we going to communicate to? How are we going to communicate to them at that point in time? What are the metrics to know if our message got through and together? The exercise that we did yesterday, there was a termination that that was made by an employee in the company. He terminated another, and he left a voicemail message for HR. So they never got the message that this person had been terminated, and he was able to get back into the building the next day. So there are some communications that are absolutely critical to make, and there was one that was, but it wasn't completed correctly. Remember, most of the time we're going to have raw information in this crisis environment that we find ourselves, and then we have to figure out what communications we're going to do. So we've got to weigh that against the exposure or the liability that it creates. And having predetermined message maps is a good way to do that. Having established what you are going to talk about certainly becomes critical, and always communicate directly and not through the media to get your message.
Yeah, I think when we talk about message maps, I always go back. That first message is the one you can have crafted, and it should be as generic and, you know, not going to have a lot of details because you don't know a lot at that point in time. But you can have those pre-approved and ready to launch immediately. The consequences you're dealing with are going to determine the follow-on communications and whether those are necessary. And I've seen it happen on both ends, over-communication and under-communication in those events.
We talk about the 3 C's of crisis communication. First is coordination. You're going to want people to do certain things. The second is the crisis itself. That's brand and reputation. And the last is for compliance, because there's some things that you're required to do. And that brings us really into the consequence management. We certainly are seeing a lot of politics. I think we're going to get to see a lot of politics through the fall as it's coming together. And you can see and tell, they shouldn't have said that. That's going to be a mistake. It's going to be a problem afterwards. And when you think about this area, the communications will trigger more consequence management opportunities.
Oh, I know.
And opportunities is a euphemism for problem associated with it. So any type of thing that's occurred, it's amazing how people come out and say, it wasn't our fault. We didn't do it. Our person wouldn't have done that. If you want to see denying liability, look at Flint, Michigan, and the water. And that somebody made a decision. It was cheaper to take it over here, and they didn't understand the consequences of that. The insides of those pipes got leached out, and now lead got into the water, and we've all seen the pictures of the family turning on the tap, and the glass is full of brown water.
Right.
And by the way, it's interesting, they're still making people pay for that contaminated water, which is a real mistake. We can only make statements in a crisis based on fact. We can't base on opinion or thoughts or I wish this would have been that way. It can only communicate a fact. If you're communicating anything else, the consequences are going to be disproportional within it. So in taking any action, making any statement, stop, think about the consequences. That's going to make a difference within it, whether it's clicking on a link in an email that suddenly gets a virus downloaded onto your computer. That click was easy. The consequences are going to be there for quite a while.
So just to kind of summarize what we've been talking about today, regardless of whether it's a crisis or a consequence, it's something that you're going to have to manage along the way. So we'll leave you with a couple of thoughts, and that is, you know, you're not going to be able to plan for everything. And it's not going to be, it's always the crisis within the crisis or the consequence of the consequence along the way. And what you're going to have to be is very agile in terms of what you do, and you're going to have to work with your team so you learn to make decisions together, weighing the future consequences or the potential consequences and how you're going to manage through those and do that as quickly as possible.
All right, and that's just carries forward here, but we think about it not in one dimension of time. It's not what is it going to mean to me today? What's it going to mean to me in the next hour? But it's what is it going to mean during the days and weeks and months and years that come for beyond that. In many cases, a crisis defines an entity more than anything else. Do you want to be known as the company who did X or where that occurred? I think I'll probably, for a long time now, remember Flint and bad water, and that'll be the first thing that comes to mind associated with it. So the consequences are going to define your organization, and this is an opportunity from a business continuity standpoint to bring that over back into a strategic brand and reputation issue. It's going to determine whether you live or die. I think it's still out on the Mexican restaurant that we've seen all the problems with in Chipotle. They immediately announced, we fixed it, the problem is gone. And then immediately they had it again. And oops is one of those words you don't want to hear a lot. You're at work and fitting into those areas. Now they closed for 4 hours and cleaned it. Imagine if they have yet again another problem. It'll make a difference in who that business is. We see positive steps making a big difference. There are other brands that have had material problems, but they focused on who they were, what they wanted to do, and how they built it so that they can continue to maintain the organization. So a crisis doesn't always equal a consequence.
Well, let's hope not, but we have to deal with many of them.
You've got to be planning there that any decision, any action does come back and equal a consequence here.
Well, and I think that the thing that's so important to remember is each decision you make has to balance to the culture of your organization. And if you don't understand your culture, you're going to make some bad decisions. I've always said immediately when you start a new job and you come in and you're faced with decisions on day one, you have a 50-50 chance of making the right or wrong decision because you don't understand the culture and the downstream impact. The same thing applies when you're in a major event. So if you're working with a team and you're trying to come up with a fine-tuned, fast responding and kind of solid response for consequence management, you want that team to understand the culture of that group, decision process, etc. And you're going to develop that as a culture that will play out through any crisis or consequence that you're managing. So I think that probably is a great way from my standpoint to sum up what we're doing, that we can give you methodology and we can give you event after event that people have done it incorrectly. But you have to understand the culture of the organization, your employee base, etc., and how that's influenced in the decisions you make.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for being on today and listening to us talk about crisis and consequence and where that's coming into play. Thank you for what you're doing every day in each one of your companies to make a difference, because we're all about preparedness. You wouldn't have taken the time out of your life today to listen to this conversation and think about it. But I would hope you will go back and review your plans and see now if there's been an emphasis on consequence. Ann, I don't know if we've got much time for questions, but...
Well, we ran it right up to the end, and I was looking at it without even Bill responding. We've been pretty quiet as far as receiving questions in, which is a good thing since we've used up all our time here today. But I'll tell you what, if anyone on the call has any questions, by all means, if you will send them to either
Firestorm
or MIR3, either one, or send us a note in responding to the webinar invite, we'll be glad to answer those questions. As I said, that we do have a brief that will be published shortly. It will not be today, obviously, as we incorporate some of this material, but will be something that we will be distributing for you and would also be available on both the Firestorm and the MIR3 websites for future download if you care to do so. So, Jim, thank you very much for hosting the webinar. It was nice, and what was even better is Jim and I had the opportunity to be sitting side by side in Atlanta rather than coast to coast, Atlanta to San Diego. But I'll admit, given the snow weather, I'll be going back to San Diego very soon because it's much warmer there. I think I heard like 78. So
my question is, when do I get a ticket? When can I come?
Right, we'll do the next one there. Thank you all for attending. Thanks for being considerate of us and joining us, and we look forward to future webinars. Jim?
Thanks everybody. Talk to you soon. Goodbye.